I thought the worst part was my wife leaving me for my best friend, until I read the letter she wrote, tearing me apart piece by piece for the whole town to see. But what started as my downfall became the beginning of a story I never saw coming. When I first met Laura, it felt like the universe had finally decided to throw me a lifeline. I had just completed my service in the Navy and returned to a life that felt unfamiliar and strange after years away. My hometown, Endicott City, hadn't changed much, but I had. Everything about civilian life felt foreign, quiet in a way that was both comforting and unnerving. Laura was a face from my past, one I hadn't seen since high school. Reconnecting with her was like rediscovering an old favorite song, one I hadn't realized I'd missed so much. At the time, I was still trying to shake off the rigidity the Navy had drilled into me. Discipline came easily, but finding a sense of purpose was a struggle. Laura, with her infectious laugh and fierce independence, quickly became my grounding force. She reminded me of simpler days, days filled with high school football games, part-time jobs, and summer bonfires, before my life had been swallowed by deployments and duty stations. Our relationship wasn't perfect, though. We clashed often. Laura would say I was too rigid, too stuck in my ways, and I thought she was reckless with money, spending like the future wasn't something to worry about. But despite those differences, we always seemed to find our way back to each other. When I proposed to her, I was sure we'd learned enough about each other to handle anything life threw at us. Marriage, though, brought challenges we hadn't anticipated. Then Jenna came along a few years later, and for a time, everything felt like it had fallen into place. Sleepless nights turned into frantic, chaotic mornings, but the laughter outweighed the arguments. Parenthood was its own brand of madness, a balancing act that kept us constantly moving, but we worked as a team. We stumbled, sure, but we never dropped the ball when it came to Jenna. Those were the best years of our lives, I think. Shared purpose and teamwork smoothed over the cracks we didn't yet have the time or energy to see. But life has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. By the time Jenna started high school, something had shifted. The easy connection Laura and I once shared was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to fill every corner of the house. We moved through our days like actors hitting their marks, saying the right things, performing the roles we thought we were supposed to play, but without the connection that once held us together. I buried myself in work, telling myself it was for the good of the family, while Laura seemed to drift further away. She grew distant in ways I didn't fully understand. Not until it was too late. The truth came crashing down on me one Monday evening, a night that started out as unremarkable as any other. When I walked into the house, I immediately felt that something was off. It was too quiet. At first, I thought maybe Laura had stepped out or needed some space after a fight we hadn't even had yet. But as I noticed the empty bathroom counter and the telltale absence of her clothes in the closet, the truth began to sink in. She was gone. Really gone. The life I thought we'd built together had shattered in a way I never saw coming. I spent weeks combing through every moment we'd shared, trying to figure out how it had all fallen apart. Now, years later, Jenna has started reaching out, and I realize it's time to confront what happened. She deserves answers, and so do I. A few days ago, an email from Jenna popped up in my inbox. It's been a while since we've spoken. I'd heard from Jenna here and there since the holidays. She'd been neck-deep in exams and preparing for spring break, so I wasn't surprised by her distance. She's always been driven, and with her focus on her studies, I figured it was best to let her keep her head down. Honestly, it might have been for the better. While Jenna was busy burying herself in books, my life had completely unraveled. Laura, my wife, her mother, walked out with no warning. One day, she was here, the next, she was gone. It sent me into a tailspin, weeks of trying to pick up the pieces of a life I thought was solid. I didn't want Jenna to get caught up in the chaos, not until I could find some clarity myself. But now, with her reaching out, I realize there's no putting this off anymore. She deserves answers, and the time to tell her everything is here, whether I feel ready or not. Jenna's email landed in my inbox a few days ago. She was upset. Apparently, she'd been trying to get in touch with Laura, but nothing was working. Laura's email had been deactivated, and the home phone was disconnected. Her frustration bled through every line of her message. How come Mom's email is gone? Why is the phone disconnected? What's going on, Dad? She wrote. She mentioned her finals were wrapping up soon, and that she'd be driving back home with some friends in a few days. She wanted to know what she was walking into. A fair question. But the answer? It's long, messy, and painful. It took me a couple of days to figure out how to respond, to put the chaos into words she could make sense of. Eventually, I sat down and typed out an email, hoping it struck the right balance between honesty and compassion. Here's what I wrote. Hi Jenna. I know you've got questions, and it's time I give you some answers. I hope you're sitting down, because what I'm about to tell you isn't easy to say, or hear. Your mom left me. She said I was the world's worst husband and that she'd found someone else. Yep, you read that right. I'll give you her new contact info so you can reach out and hear her side too, but I wanted you to hear it from me first. As for the home phone, I disconnected it. Honestly, it was mostly telemarketers and spam calls, and after everything that's happened, I figured we didn't need it. I also got a new cell number, which I'll send to you after this. From there, I struggled with how much to say about Laura's departure and the events leading up to it. Looking back, I wondered if I could have done more, if I should have. I wrote. I thought I was doing okay, keeping her in the loop about when I'd be out with Glenn or catching a game, but maybe I wasn't trying hard enough. She wasn't much of a communicator either, though. She kept her interests to herself and dismissed mine as guy stuff. Eventually, I just stopped trying and stuck to my own thing. Turns out, she did the same, but with Glenn. Here's the kicker, Laura and Glenn left together. My so-called best friend and your mom. They bailed right after the last Bears game in January. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, knowing Jenna deserved to know the truth, even if it was ugly. The betrayal still stings, Laura and Glenn. It's a sentence I can barely get out without feeling my stomach drop. I'm trying to process it all myself, but now Jenna's reaching out, and she deserves more than just the scraps of clarity I've managed to piece together. When she comes home, I know we'll have to talk face to face. That's a conversation I'm bracing myself for, but it's one I know I can't avoid. If nothing else, Jenna deserves honesty and a chance to make sense of the wreckage her parents left in their wake. It's strange, isn't it? To feel like you've won a battle only to realize the war has left you standing alone. That's how it feels now. Laura and Glenn are gone, just like that. At first, I didn't know Glenn was involved. I thought she'd run off with some stranger, someone she'd met on a whim. I started calling everyone, her family, her friends, even her boss, trying to piece together where she could have gone. Her boss was furious, told me Laura had quit without notice. That was my first real clue that something wasn't right, but I still wasn't prepared for what came next. For over a year, Laura got up with me every morning, left for work, and came home in the evening like clockwork. She acted like everything was normal. But looking back now, I can see it wasn't. Maybe I was just too blind to notice. I always thought I had married someone who shared my values, especially when it came to commitment. I didn't have the option of half measures. Once I said, I do, I meant it. Glenn, on the other hand, was never that kind of guy. He was the life of every party but couldn't stay loyal to save his life. He'd been married twice before, both short-lived because, well, he couldn't keep his promises, or his pants zipped. Laura and I had reconnected after my Navy years, and back then, she told me Glenn had broken her heart too many times. She said she missed the way I treated her, the way I made her feel valued. And I still loved her, so we got married. But now, looking back, it feels like the cruelest kind of joke. When I found out the truth, that Laura and Glenn had run off together, it felt like the ground disappeared beneath me. Her note wasn't just a goodbye, it was a gut punch. She called me a boring, lazy, selfish fat slob and made it painfully clear what she thought of me as a husband and a man. She gloated about her mind-blowing relationship with Glenn and said they were starting a new life together. She even suggested I divorce her, though she doubted anyone else would ever want me. The first time I read her letter, I skimmed it. I think I was in shock, too numb to process the full weight of her words. But when I reread it later, the insults hit me like a sledgehammer. She hated me, probably had for a long time. And the worst part? I couldn't even argue with most of what she said. Was I the boring, selfish slob she described? Maybe. I looked back at our marriage, and I couldn't deny that I'd failed in so many ways. I wasted time. I spent too many nights living separate lives, hanging out with guys in the same rut as me, instead of investing in my marriage. Sure, I worked hard to provide for her, but emotionally, I'd given her so little. She tried to involve me in her interests early on, but when she dismissed me, I gave up too easily. And, honestly, I resented her for brushing me off. Then there was Glenn. He always got the attention. He was loud, confident, charming, everything I wasn't. I never thought I was hideous, though. Back in high school and the Navy, I dated plenty. There were flings, relationships, women seemed to find me attractive enough. Were they all blind? Or had I just lost whatever it was that used to make me appealing? I couldn't help but wonder what made me worse than the next guy. There are plenty of husbands who mess up, who don't always put their wives first. But most of them don't have wives who run off with their best friend. So what made me different? What made me so easy to leave behind? Jen is the only steady female presence left in my life now. The thought of trying to move on, to imagine a future with someone else, feels impossible. My marriage is over, but the weight of it still sits heavy on my chest. Maybe Glenn and Laura were right about me. Maybe I didn't give enough. Or maybe this is just one of those cruel twists of fate that doesn't have a neat answer. All I know is I'm left here, trying to figure out who I am without them, and what, if anything, is left to rebuild. I wasn't sure how to process everything that had happened, but I knew I needed a different perspective, preferably a woman's. Asking a guy for advice felt out of the question, so my mind turned to Nora Ashford. Nora was the office manager at Telco, someone who was always warm, approachable, and kind without crossing into pity. She was smart, confident, and carried herself in a way that seemed to put everyone at ease. She was also attractive, probably a little older than Laura, but the kind of woman who made you notice her without trying. When I decided to talk to her, I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to ask or even how to bring it up. I rehearsed the conversation in my head a dozen times before walking into her office, but the moment she greeted me with her easy smile, everything I'd planned evaporated. "Vince, what's up?" she asked, her tone gentle but curious. It was clear she sensed something was off. Nora didn't know everything about what I was going through, but she already had an impression of me from work. At Telco, technicians had a bit of a reputation. Some cheated the clock, took side gigs during company hours, or even got too friendly with customers who happened to be lonely housewives. Vince, however, was different. In my role managing the team that handled logs and work records, I'd seen the worst. I'd even caught a tech named Rick bragging about fixing cabling issues while upselling customers on phones they didn't actually need, phones he later sold for personal profit. It was men like Rick who gave Telco a bad name, but Vince wasn't like them. When I took over as manager, my team, 23 women, many of whom had worked there for years, unanimously agreed that Vince was Telco's best technician. He didn't cheat the system, slack off, or exploit anyone. And according to them, he didn't cheat on his wife either. That last part stuck with me. I'd heard about the letter Laura wrote, the one that tore Vince apart, and I couldn't reconcile it with the man I knew from work. Out of curiosity, I decided to get to know him better. That's how we ended up sitting together in the back booth at Benny's Diner, finishing our meals. I'd ordered a chicken Caesar salad, no croutons, a small effort to shed the fat slob label Laura had thrown at me. Nora, on the other hand, had a veal parmesan sub with fries, onion rings, and iced tea. She didn't seem the least bit worried about watching her figure, and, honestly, she didn't need to. She exuded confidence, and I couldn't help but admire her. She leaned in, her voice soft but steady. "Vince, how are you holding up?" I hesitated before answering, unsure if I could even put it into words. But then Nora reached into her bag and slid something across the table. My stomach dropped. How did you get that?" I whispered, my throat tight. She met my eyes, her expression full of understanding. "Laura emailed it to her friends," she explained gently. "It got forwarded, everywhere." I felt the room spin. "All over town?" I managed to ask. She nodded. "Everyone knows." The weight of it hit me like a brick wall. I put my head down on the table, overwhelmed by the humiliation. The insults Laura had thrown at me in that letter, the ones I tried to compartmentalize and ignore, were now public knowledge. I couldn't escape them. Nora's hand found my shoulder, firm but comforting. "You're not going to hide, Vince," she said, her voice steady. "Here's what you're going to do: pay the bill, tip Jean generously, and walk out of here with your head high. You can't let this define you." That kindness, her easy humor, and her refusal to let me wallow, those things stood out. But so did her dress. I'd be lying if I said I didn't notice it. When Nora came downstairs earlier, she was wearing a bright yellow dress that perfectly complemented her red hair. It wasn't just the color that caught my attention, though. The design was striking. Strategically placed cutouts teased glimpses of her toned sides, the curve of her lower back, and even the tops of her thighs through a high slit. It was the kind of dress you couldn't help but notice, and I certainly wasn't the only one. She wasn't wearing a bra, or if she was, it was some kind of invisible one, and the effect was, well, distracting. Nora noticed the looks I was giving her and didn't seem bothered. She placed her hand on my shoulder again, grounding me. "You're going to be okay, Vince," she said firmly. And for the first time in weeks, I believed her. I'll admit, hearing Nora's perspective on Laura's letter threw me. After carrying the weight of those words for so long, they had started to feel like an undeniable truth. But Nora didn't see it that way. "I've read that letter," she said softly, her tone laced with conviction, "and I've talked to the women at Telco who've read it too. You know what we think? It says more about Laura than it does about you." I looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" She leaned in, her gaze steady and reassuring. "We see you, Vince. We see how you treat people, how hard you work. You're one of the kindest, most genuine men we know. And Laura? She comes across as bitter, mean-spirited, and honestly, spoiled." Her words hit me like a lifeline, but I wasn't ready to let go of the self-doubt Laura's letter had planted in me. But what if she wasn't wrong? I said quietly. What if I really was lazy or selfish? Nora poured me another glass of wine, and I took a long sip, letting the Zinfandel's warmth dull my anxiety. Was I lazy? I asked aloud, thinking it through. I mean, maybe I wasn't the most productive guy at home. I did my chores when Laura asked, helped out with vacuuming and dishes, and I was pretty hands-on when Jenna was a baby. But if I wasn't working or out with the guys, yeah, I guess I was just sitting around. Nora's brow furrowed as she listened. "What about Laura?" she asked. "What did she do all day? Did she work?" "She worked a little," I admitted. "She'd take on small gigs here and there, but mostly, she focused on childcare. I figured that was fair, Jenna needed her." Nora smiled knowingly. "And you? Were you the type to get involved with your kid, or did you leave it all to Laura?" Oh, I loved being involved, I said, a genuine smile spreading across my face as I recalled those early days. Baths, diapers, feedings, I did it all. It made me feel closer to Jenna, even when I ended up getting peed on half the time. Nora's expression softened. That's exactly my point, Vince. That list Laura wrote? It's garbage. Let's go through it. I nodded, handing over the paper as if giving her permission to pick apart my deepest insecurities. First, she began, ugly. That's ridiculous. You're not winning beauty contests, but you're far from ugly. Honestly, Vince, I've been looking at you all night, and, she paused, meeting my eyes. I think you're a handsome guy. Her words left me stunned. I hadn't heard anything like that in years. Wait, you're serious? I asked hesitantly. Completely, she said with a smile. And as a bonus, I'd be happy to personally investigate the last item on Laura's list. Her teasing broke the tension, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I laughed. Really laughed. But then Nora stood, and in one smooth motion, she pulled off her dress. I froze, completely speechless. She was stunning, her confidence as striking as her curves. Standing there, she reminded me of a painting I'd once admired in a museum, a perfect balance of strength and vulnerability. The rest of that weekend? It was unforgettable. We spent hours talking, laughing, and rediscovering parts of ourselves we thought were long gone. By Sunday night, as we lay together in a quiet moment, she turned to me, her eyes misty with emotion. Oh, Vince, she whispered, those feelings I had for you at Benny's. They've grown so much stronger now. I don't want to let you go. I want you all to myself. And if agreeing with Laura's letter keeps other women away, then so be it, I want to be the only one to tempt you. Her words hung in the air, a mixture of passion and sincerity that left me breathless. Standing there, inches apart, I finally found my voice. Nora, I said, focusing on her, I want to keep this going for as long as we can. I'm never going to get tired of you. Not now. Not ever. She smiled through the tears in her eyes and kissed me softly. Then it's a deal, she said. I'm yours, Vince. Before she left that night, she added with a playful grin, oh, and when are you coming to my office? We've got to keep things professional, right? I couldn't help but laugh. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. When I suggested showing Nora off to her team on Friday, I didn't expect her playful response. Good, she said with a smirk. Be there by 4:45, or I'll make your life a living hell. When I arrived at her office, every single pair of eyes turned toward me. The air was thick with curiosity, but Nora didn't seem to notice or care. She finished her call, walked right over to me, and kissed me like no one else in the world existed. When she finally pulled away, she turned to her team with a grin. The silence that followed was palpable. They were fascinated, maybe even a little stunned. Finally, Loretta, one of her team members, broke the tension. We read your email, she said. I nodded, unsure of where this was going. You told Jenna everything. That was admirable, she continued, her tone sincere. Before I could respond, she added, Mr. Moretti, your wife's letter, it's the worst thing I've ever read. I even sent it to my dad, and he said if he ever got a letter like that, it would have been a double homicide. Great, I thought. Now my story had traveled beyond the town limits. My humiliation was no longer local, it had gone interstate. But then Loretta added something that caught me off guard. Your story, dedicating yourself to work, getting in shape, meeting Nora, we all cried. It was inspiring. I didn't know how to respond, but Nora jumped in with her usual humor. His presence might cramp our style, she teased, but if you don't like the sights and sounds, you better wear earplugs and blinders. The office erupted in laughter, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the guy defined by Laura's venomous words. Things weren't perfect, though. Jenna had been adjusting to everything in her own way. Once, after teasing me about some lingering dad flab, she barged into my room at the wrong time, without knocking. After that awkward incident, she learned the value of closed doors and knocking first. On her last day home before heading back to college, she waited for her friends to pick her up and gave me one of her signature smirks. "Dad," she said, "you and Nora should write a sequel to your email. You know, let everyone know how things turned out." "We'll think about it," I replied, laughing at the idea. But Laura's shadow wasn't so easy to shake. The letter she wrote and the way Glenn had orchestrated their escape still haunted me. Their departure wasn't just a betrayal, it was a performance meant to humiliate me. For a while, it worked. After that letter circulated, it defined me in the eyes of the town. I even believed it myself for a while. But their happily ever after didn't last long. 83 miles into their great escape, Glenn's trailer broke down. They ended up stuck in a small town, and reality hit hard. Glenn might not have been boring or ugly, but he was lazy, selfish, and broke. All the excitement Laura thought she was chasing fizzled out when faced with the harsh truth of life with him. When I told Nora about their downfall, she just laughed. "Well, it's been fun, Vince," she teased. "I'll sit at home biting my nails, wondering if she's going to steal you back." But it wasn't long before I found myself sitting across from Laura at a Denny's. She looked tired, worn down in a way I'd never seen before. 83 miles, she said bitterly. "That's how far we got before Glenn's trailer broke down. It couldn't be fixed, so we had it towed to some lot where he works. And now I'm stuck living in it." She stared into her coffee for a long moment before continuing. "Glenn's out most nights, doing God knows what." "What a shock, huh?" I stayed quiet, letting her words hang in the air. She finally looked up, her eyes hollow. "You know, your job, Jenna, everything he did was to bring you down. And I let him." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "I thought he loved me." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "And the letter?" She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "That was his idea. He said." She paused, visibly grappling with the shame. "He said it would be the final nail in the coffin. That you'd never recover. That it would prove I was right to leave you." I didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. The damage had been done, and Laura was finally starting to see the consequences of the choices she had made. Leaving that Denny's, I felt a mix of emotions, relief, anger, and maybe even a small sense of pity. But more than anything, I felt gratitude. Gratitude for the life I was starting to rebuild. Gratitude for Nora. And gratitude for the fact that, no matter how much Laura and Glenn tried to destroy me, they didn't. "I exaggerated things," Laura admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I made you sound worse than you are. It was cruel. Can you forgive me?" I looked her in the eyes, trying to gauge if there was any real regret behind her words. "Maybe a little," I said finally. "But I'll never forget it, Laura. You went out of your way to humiliate me, to destroy me." Sharing that letter, I shook my head. "That was lower than stealing our savings. You didn't even give me a chance to fix things." Laura's gaze dropped to the table, and for a moment, I thought she might respond with more remorse. But instead, she stumbled into something completely different. "So, I was wondering about those Bears tickets. Could I go in on them again?" I blinked, caught off guard by the audacity. "You're kidding, right?" She hesitated. "I mean, if it's not too much trouble." I clenched my jaw, barely containing my irritation. "Well, Glenn," I said firmly, barely disguising my sarcasm, "I already paid for the tickets, but sure. Come by with your half of the money. Hand it to me. In person. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Maybe I'll just mail a check," Glenn stammered. "No, Glenn," I replied, my voice steady and sharp. "Come over. Prove you're not scared. If you're still standing after that chat, I'll give you both tickets for free." Silence hung on the line for a moment before he muttered something about thinking it over, and hung up. It was clear Glenn wasn't ready to face me, or the fallout of his choices. In the months following the debacle with Laura and Glenn, I poured myself into rebuilding my life. Nora was by my side through it all, supporting me as I tackled everything from work to my physical health. I ended up losing 26 pounds, and eventually, my body settled into a healthier place. One afternoon, as I was buttoning up my shirt, Nora gave me a once-over and smirked. "You're starting to look like a Greek god," she teased. "Which one?" I asked, playing along. "Bacchus," she shot back with a laugh. "Always a wise ass." By July, my divorce was finalized, and Nora made a surprise announcement: we were getting married in September. "Why so long?" I teased, smirking. "Smartass," she replied, smacking my arm playfully. "It takes time to get a dress and plan everything." Truthfully, she wasn't kidding. Jenna, along with the ladies from her office, had taken over most of the wedding planning. They were determined to pull off something spectacular, and I wasn't about to argue. At work, things were shifting too. My focus on my job hadn't gone unnoticed. Telco's CEO explained it best during a company meeting. Vince had two major jumps in his career trajectory. The first happened after a big life change, when he decided to focus on being the best technician we've ever had. His wife had left him, and during that tough time, he realized the one thing he still had was his pride in his work. So, he committed himself completely to being the best. Suddy, one of my co-workers, smirked and jumped in. The second jump happened when he met someone new, an extremely lucky woman. She stuck her tongue out at me, clearly enjoying the moment. He wanted to show her how good he could be, and let me tell you, he's been showing off ever since. I blushed because, well, it was true. Having Nora in my life gave me a renewed sense of purpose. As time went on, my efforts paid off in ways I hadn't anticipated. After a series of promotions, including replacing some less-than-stellar employees, like Tony Franco, who was fired for incompetence, I was promoted to Director of Maintenance. The role was eventually elevated to a VP-level position with added responsibilities for customer service. The promotion raised a few eyebrows due to my relationship with Nora, but I resolved the potential conflict by rewriting Telco's policies to ensure everything was transparent and compliant. As VP, I overhauled the entire system, creating an environment where both the company and its employees could thrive. Looking back now, I can see how far I've come, from being the guy defined by Laura's letter to someone who found strength, purpose, and love again. Nora and I aren't just moving forward, we're building something better than I ever imagined. And for that, I'm grateful every day. When Vince took charge, he didn't waste any time shaking things up. One of his first moves was to hold a meeting with all the technicians. He didn't sugarcoat it. "Clean up your act," he told them bluntly, "or I'll find new techs to replace you." It was a wake-up call, and Vince introduced performance metrics to back up his words. He set ambitious targets, not unreachable, but enough to demand focus. Initially, he aimed for 85 to 90% of his pre-reform standards, but the early results hovered around 78 to 79%. To push improvement, Vince rolled out performance bonuses for the top 5 technicians. That move alone drove productivity up to nearly 88%, proving that recognition and incentives could motivate the team far more than threats ever could. One of Vince's most impactful changes was rewriting Telco's maintenance policy. Previously, failed equipment was scrapped, a practice that was both wasteful and expensive. Vince implemented a replace and repair system, where failed items were brought back for evaluation and, where possible, refurbished. This approach wasn't just about cost-cutting, it was inspired by his part-time work with disabled individuals, teaching him the value of patience and resourcefulness. The new system also included leveraging military benefits for veterans on the team, saving costs while boosting morale. The results spoke for themselves. Vince's reforms slashed telco's maintenance costs by 28% in the first full quarter. The black market schemes, where some techs had been funneling stolen or scrapped equipment, were eliminated completely. Sinclair, the company's CEO, was impressed and doubled down on his support for Vince's initiatives. Vince then turned his attention to telco's customer service division, which had long been a source of complaints. Poorly trained, underpaid, and unmotivated staff were the norm. Vince and Nora hosted a series of meetings with Wilma Falla, the head of customer service. Frustrated after years of underfunding, Wilma welcomed the chance to rebuild. Together, they implemented a hiring strategy focused on competitive pay and offered employees the same healthcare opt-out bonuses that had been so successful in other areas. 3 quarters later, telco had reduced maintenance costs to 22% below industry competitors, and customer satisfaction scores skyrocketed. This led to major new contracts and rising stock prices. Sinclair, recognizing Vince's effectiveness, fired 2 underperforming VPs and promoted candidates Vince had recommended. To further prepare him for senior management, Sinclair assigned 2 retired executives, Roger Platt and Jim Hartman, to mentor Vince. Their guidance helped Vince navigate the complexities of corporate leadership. The real turning point came when telco announced its new COO and deputy COO, Roger Platt and Vince Moretti. The 2 men stood on stage together at the announcement, both dressed in matching telco uniforms, dark gray trousers and navy blazers with the company's logo embroidered on the pocket. The uniform idea was one Vince and Nora had developed, symbolizing unity between leadership and employees. As Vince stepped forward to address the crowd, he found Nora in the audience, mouthed, "I love you," and beamed as the room erupted in applause. It was a defining moment, one that signaled how far he had come, not just in his career but in rebuilding his life. A year later, Vince officially became telco's COO. Donning the same telco blazer he'd worn at the announcement, he joined the executive team with pride. Yet, even as he celebrated the accomplishment, doubts lingered in his mind. "I don't think I fit the image of a COO," Vince confided to Sinclair one day. Sinclair shook his head firmly. "You're confusing polish with capability. Most of those so-called polished executives grew up privileged. They care more about appearances than actual results. What I need in a COO is a problem solver, and that's exactly what you are." He leaned forward, his voice unwavering. "You've turned telco around by identifying issues, making bold changes, and delivering results. Sure, you've made mistakes, but you've learned quickly and adapted. And let me tell you something, Vince, the stockholders think you're exactly what this company needs." It was then that Vince realized his journey wasn't about fitting into someone else's mold, it was about rewriting the rules and proving that hard work, resilience, and integrity were the true markers of leadership.